Far from your dime novel hero, he's not exactly that, romantic young man. He is Herr Julian Klezmer. Klezmer, of course, the Yiddish term for musician. And he is a temperamental Jew who conforms to the stereotype of the Jewish artist. Here, a pianist-composer who uses his talent to overcome the liabilities associated with his race. And you've noticed, which is how Jewishness is referred to throughout the novel, as it was in England at the time. The German term, there's a German term that's entered the English language called salonfähig, which derives from that period. It means that you're fit for salon society, acceptable to that social class. And I think it applies perfectly to the Jewish musician who is acceptable by virtue of his indisputable talent. So Herr Klezmer, who is described as a felicitous combination of the German, the Slav, and the Semite, has a similarly triple braided function in the plot, I think, as an artist, as a kind of wandering Jew, and as representative of a new kind of aristocracy of merit that can no longer be patronized in the traditional ways. First, as the artist. I think if you read some of him, he's a little bit caricatured, but on the other hand, also taken seriously. George Eliot ascribes to Klezmer some of her own occasional impatience with the way art has to earn its keep by satisfying buyers who don't fully appreciate what they're paying for. So you have him at one point saying quite impatiently, "No man has too much talent to be a musician. Most men have too little. A creative artist is no more a mere musician than a great statesman is a mere politician. We are not ingenuous puppets or ingenious puppets, sir, who live in a box and look out on the world only when it is gaping for amusement. We help to rule the nations and make the age as much as any other public men. We count ourselves on level benches with legislators, and a man who speaks effectively through music is compelled to something more difficult than parliamentary eloquence." So, in a sense, this is like Shelley's saying that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. But on the other hand, it shows you that he is taking himself very seriously and taking his art at a level of tremendous seriousness and comparing it, you see, with real governance, with really those who speak up in Parliament. So there's a little bit of George Eliot's own impatience in that, I think. But then she ascribes to Klezmer something else as well. He has a little bit of charm. On his first meeting with Gwendolen, he seems, almost as enamored of her, or almost as taken with her as Deronda originally is. So it says his English had little foreignness except its fluency, and his alarming cleverness was made less formidable just then by a certain softening air of silliness, which will sometimes befall even genius in the desire of being agreeable to beauty. So here we see that, like Deronda, Klezmer is also a little dazzled by Gwendolen's beauty, but also like Deronda, he recoils when she offends his principle of excellence. So just as Deronda subordinates beauty to morality, Klezmer does the same thing according to the standard of artistic excellence. When Gwendolen sings for the company and then fishes for his approval, he tells her, "It is always a pleasure to see you sing." And the narrator asks, was there ever so unexpected an assertion of superiority, at least before the late Teutonic conquest? So this little joke comparing Klezmer's chutzpah with the early German invasion of England makes fun of his arrogance, but without apologizing for his severity in telling Gwendolen that she was badly taught and that her repertoire is comprised of timid crowd pleasers. And the narrator remarks, "Woman was dear to him, but music was dearer. So otherwise obliging, Klezmer shows himself a priest in the defense of artistic standards. And I use the term priest advisedly in the same way that we will see it recurring in the religious imagery that defines Deronda's relation to Gwendolen. And to anticipate maybe later chapters, if Mordechai functions as the Kohen in this book, Klezmer, the musician, is the Levite, right? The ancient classifications that once served a sacred purpose in Jewish religious life continue in modern Jewish forms, and this Cohen and this Levi are now in the service of improving the British as well as their fellow Jews. So that's the artist. Then secondly, Klezmer is a wandering Jew, and he is in the process of assimilating without ever denying his Jewishness. He is indifferent to the question of nationalism, Jewish or otherwise, having substituted for nationality an allegiance to music. And there is nothing about him of the cringing apologist who is the worst product of the Jewish exile. Quite the opposite. His chief attribute is his incorruptible authority, so that he always seems to loom over those who try to belittle him. When Mrs. Arrowpoint, his patroness, calls him in to let him know that they are going to disinherit their daughter if she marries him, she threatens, "You will not marry her fortune." And Klezmer replies, "Madam, her fortune has been the only thing I have had to regret about her." Right? And a little later he says, "I consider it out of the power either of you or your fortune to confer on me anything that I value. My rank as an artist is of my own winning, and I would not exchange it for any other. I am able to maintain your daughter, and I ask for no change in my life but her companionship." So, Jew and musician, he holds himself to an independent, principled, and implicitly higher standard, and he lets everyone else know it. So during the conversation then, between this wonderful conversation between the teacher and the student, when they finally make their feelings known to one another, Klezmer says he cannot take Catherine's advice to appease the suitor who has just insulted him. And he tells her, "Even you can't understand the wrath of the artist. He is of another caste for you," meaning he's of a lower caste for you. "That is true," said Catherine with some betrayal of feeling. "He is of a caste to which I look up, a caste above mine." So she confirms, basically, that this is a new caste system, and that the artist here is the real artist, the true artist, is supreme over the aristocracy which had tried to impose its status on him, over him. So George Eliot, I say, lightly mocks Klezmer's inflated rhetoric and his pride, yet it is the pride of someone who has to stand up for himself. And then there is a third function, I think, of Klezmer. I don't want to reduce him to these categories, but he does play that kind of part in the book. He is the resident alien, and it is his role, among others, to expose and to foil the anti-Jewish prejudice. The Arrowpoints were pleased to maintain him as a cultural showpiece, but they are outraged when their daughter wishes to marry him. We judge the other characters in the book according to the levels of prejudice that they feel toward Klezmer, with the most admirable, like Hugo Mallinger, being the least prejudiced, and his nephew, Henley Mallinger, the most biased. But on the whole, the relatively quick acceptance of this marriage by the parents, initially strongly opposed to it, tells us which way the tide is going. We have to see how quickly the turnabout comes, right? They're opposed, it happens, they're reconciled, right? So as Britain got used to the idea of having Disraeli as their prime minister, a baptized but not at all humbled Jew, they were growing accustomed to Jews in the arts as well as in the trades and as well as in parliament. So klezmer is artist, Jew, and one who inverts the pattern of patronage by setting the standard of culture and dictating its price so that he becomes the arbiter of taste and everything else, and he becomes a social rival in this new aristocracy of good taste, of culture. The arrow points, after all, are themselves upstarts, having made their money in trade. So now here is another upstart, challenging their supremacy in salons and concert halls. Now, shortly before Julian Klezmer and Catherine Arrowpoint determined to marry, and just before Deronda sees Gwendolyn Harleth at that German resort, a second Jewish musician enters the story with a different challenge to British norms, from the bottom rather than the top of society. Mira Cohn, or Lapidoth, is a penniless refugee who is about to take her life. She doesn't threaten the self-importance of local aristocrats with a higher standard of culture and taste, but once she's rescued and shown kindness and hospitality, I would say that she poses a different and ultimately greater kind of challenge to her hosts. These two Jews, Klezmer and Cohn Lapidoth, both reinforce and complement or balance one another. They are both unmistakably good at what they do. Mira has been on stage since childhood. She's been taught